In the first week of September 1914, the German army was just 30 miles from Paris. The French government had already fled to Bordeaux. Trains out of the capital were so packed that people were climbing onto roofs. At the Louvre, curators were boxing up the treasures. Barricades went up across the Seine bridges, and the bridges themselves were wired with explosives. In the cafes, old men who remembered 1870 talked about the coming siege. They remembered how starving Parisians had eaten the zoo animals, including two famous elephants named Castor and Pollux. 44 years later, Parisians wonder whether it was about to happen again. The British commander, Sir John French, was writing cables to London in which he used the word evacuation. Everyone thought it was over. The generals, the politicians, the soldiers walking south in the summer heat, wool uniforms sticking to their backs, feet bleeding in their boots. Everyone thought the war that had been promised would be over by Christmas was about to end even faster than that. Paris in the German hands, France knocked out, finished before the leaves ever fell. They were wrong. What happened over the next 6 days just didn't save Paris. It trapped the entire world in a war nobody knew how to end. It killed the 19th century, it gave birth to the 20th, and it turned on the smallest things. A general who wouldn't like his colleague, an old man who wouldn't stop making phone calls, 600 taxicabs. This is the story of the First Battle of the Marne. I am Benito and welcome to the Jacked Historian. The Marne makes no sense until you see what Europe had turned into by the summer of 1914. Not what it looked like in the history books, what it actually felt like. To the generals planning the wars, to the farmers about to be drafted, to the politicians who thought they had everything under control. Europe in 1914 was a continent that had convinced itself it was too civilized for a big war. 43 years had passed since the last major conflict of the continent, the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 to 1871. It lasted 6 weeks. 6 weeks for Prussia to crush France, capture Napoleon III, and proclaim the German Empire in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, on French soil, in the French King's Palace. They took Alsace and Lorraine. They paraded their troops down the Champs-Élysées, and for 43 years after that, every French officer who went to bed at night went to bed thinking about revenge. Revanche, that's the word. It wasn't a fringe idea in France, it was the default. Schoolboys were taught that Alsace and Lorraine was the lost provinces, and someday they'd come home. Cartographers drew the border region in black, like mourning. Everybody knew the rematch was coming. While France dreamed of revenge, Europe was signing treaties. By 1914, the five great powers, Germany, France, Britain, Russia, Austria-Hungary, were locked into two alliance blocks that pointed at each other like loaded guns. The Triple Entente, France, Britain, Russia. The Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. Though Italy was going to switch sides the moment the shooting started, because Italy in 1914 was Italy in 1914. The whole idea was to prevent war. If any two powers fought, they'd drag everyone else in. Nobody would dare to start anything. There was the theory. Deterrence. Peace through the threat of total catastrophe, total destruction. However, this did not work. It never works. And all an alliance system does is guarantee that a small problem becomes a big one. And in the summer of 1914, a small problem arrived right on schedule. A Serbian teenager shot an Austrian archduke in a town called Sarajevo, and within 6 weeks, every major power in Europe was at war. But even that by itself wouldn't have been enough to produce the Marne. For that, you need to understand the German piece. Germany had a problem nobody else had. Two enemies, France in the west and Russia to the east, and one army. Fight a two-front war and you lose. The only question is how long it takes. So for 20 years, a German general named Alfred von Schlieffen sat in an office in Berlin and worked on one problem. How do you fight a two-front war and win it? Schlieffen was a cold, obsessive man, the kind of officer who worked through Christmas Eve and handed his daughter a military history book as a gift. His answer was elegant in the way that a guillotine is elegant. Russia, he reasoned, was huge but slow. 6 weeks to fully mobilize, 6 weeks of empty space in the east, 6 weeks where Germany could face France alone. Here was the plan. When war came, Germany would throw almost everything it had, 7/8 of the entire army at France, not into the fortified border in the east where the French were expecting them, through Belgium, through the flat country in the north where armies could move fast. A massive right-wing sweep around Paris from the west, crushing the French army against its own border fortresses. 6 weeks to defeat France. Then put the whole army on trains, race east, and deal with Russia before the Russians were ready. The whole thing depended on speed. According to the legend that grew up around him, Schlieffen's last words on his deathbed in 1913 were, "Keep the right wing strong." Whether he actually said it, we do not know. What we know is that whoever told the story first understood exactly what mattered. When Schlieffen died, his plan passed to a new chief of staff, Helmuth von Moltke the Younger, nephew of the legendary field marshal who'd won 1870, cultured man, played the cello, translated Maeterlinck into German in his spare time. He was by every account a decent human being. He was also not his uncle. Moltke got nervous. Too risky, he thought. So he did what men like Moltke always do with plans they didn't write. He weakened it. He moved divisions from the right wing to the left. Not many. Enough. Keep the right wing strong, Schlieffen had said. Moltke made it weaker. Historians still argue whether the original plan could have worked even at full strength. Logistics, Belgian resistance, the sheer physical limits of men on foot. These things might have doomed it anyway. We will never know, because Moltke is the one who held the pen when the war began, and Moltke made the plan weaker. And then, because the plan still required going through Belgium, Germany had to deal with one last problem. Belgium was neutral. Had been neutral since 1839 by international treaty. And one of the countries that had signed that treaty was Britain. The German Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg was informed that Britain might go to war to defend Belgian neutrality. He was astonished. All this, he said, for a scrap of paper? A scrap of paper indeed. On August 4th, 1914, German troops crossed the Belgian border. That same day, Britain declared war on Germany. And here is the thing that matters. Everyone in Europe thought this war would be short. The Germans said Paris by Christmas. The French said Berlin by Christmas. The British said home by Christmas. Kaiser Wilhelm told his troops they will be home before the leaves fall from the trees. Officers booked hotel rooms in Paris for September. Soldiers on the trains heading west chalked Nach Paris on the sides of the cattle cars toward Paris. Nobody was planning for a long war. Nobody had stockpiled for a long war. That universal, continent-wide, absolutely wrong belief is what makes everything that follows possible. It's why the Germans gamble everything on a 6-week campaign. It's why the French charge into machine guns with bayonets. It's why the Marne, when it finally comes, is going to be a catastrophe. Because the Marne is the battle where Europe discovers that the short war it was promised is not coming. But that's September. First, we need to talk about August. August 1914. If you could fly over Europe, you would see something that had never happened before in human history. 40 million men moving at the same time. The German mobilization was the marvel. 1.5 million soldiers called up from their villages and their factories, put on trains, moved to border, and deployed in attack formations in 12 days. 11,000 trains ran the mobilization schedule. A train crossed the Hohenzollern Bridge at Cologne every 10 minutes, day and night for 2 weeks. One German general, when the Kaiser asked if the plan could be stopped, said, "No, Your Majesty, the trains are already moving." So you need to imagine this giant machinery put in motion could not be stopped because the logistics involved the movement of a large amount of people. The trains were already moving. In 1914, war had become so industrial, so dependent on railway timetables that the men in charge of it could no longer stop it once it started. The machine had to run until it broke. Here is what it felt like to be one of those 1.5 million Germans on those trains. You're 22 or 23. You did your 2 years of service, then reserves. 3 days ago, you were at your factory job. Yesterday, you put on that stiff, new field gray uniform. Today, you're packed into a cattle car with 40 other men rolling west. And people are throwing flowers as the train passes. Girls in white dresses, old women weeping, veterans standing at attention. You are 22 years old and you're going to be home for Christmas. And you're going to win. This is not fiction. There are thousands of letters and diaries describing exactly this scene. The Germans in August of 1914 believed, absolutely. The French believed too. The British believed. It was a war that began in a kind of ecstasy. The French plan was called Plan XVII. Plan XVII had one idea, revanche. Take back Alsace-Lorraine, charge east, take back what Germany had stolen in 1870, dictate terms from a position of moral and territorial strength. It was a plan built around an emotion that was 43 years old. Worse, Plan XVII was built on a military doctrine that had become almost religious in the French army. They called it the cult of the offensive. The idea that what wins battles isn't firepower, position, or logistics. It's élan, spirit, the willingness to attack. The French soldier charging with the fixed bayonet, singing the Marseillaise, would always defeat an enemy who stood and shot at him. Because the French soldier had élan, because he had guts, because he was French. This is not me mocking them. This is what the French army genuinely believed in 1914. This is what was in their field manuals. It's why the French infantryman in August of 1914 was still, and you need to hear this clearly, still wearing a bright blue coat and bright red trousers, pantalon rouge, visible from a mile away, because hiding was what cowards did, because a French soldier advertised himself and charged. Machine guns didn't care about élan. On August 7th, the French launched Plan XVII. They charged east into Alsace-Lorraine, red trousers, blue coats, bayonets, bugles. The Germans, holding the heights, opened up the Maxim guns and the 77mm field artillery. What happened next was the worst 2 weeks in the history of the French army. On August 27, 1914, one day, a single day, 27,000 French soldiers were killed. Let me say that again, because your brain will want to skip past it. 27,000 dead in one day. That is more French soldiers than would die on any single day of Verdun, more than any day of the Somme, more than any day of any battle in the entire war. On August 22nd, 1914, French suffered the worst day in its military history, and almost nobody today, not even most Frenchmen, knows the date. They died because they were told to charge men with machine guns. They died because their trousers were bright red. They died because 43 years of preparation had produced a doctrine that was wrong in every way a doctrine can be wrong. A French officer, Charles de Gaulle, yes, that de Gaulle, the one who will liberate Paris 30 years later, he was 23 years old and a lieutenant in the 33rd Infantry Regiment, was wounded on August 15th in one of these charges. He wrote later, "It appeared in a flash that all the courage in the world could not prevail against gunfire. All the courage in the world could not prevail against gunfire." That's the sentence. Courage could not prevail. Elan could not prevail against the Maxim gun. The red trousers were ornament for corpses. In 3 weeks, the French army lost over 200,000 men, an entire generation, the flower of French youth, the boys with the good education, commissioned as junior officers who had to lead from the front with their sabers drawn. Those boys were dead in fields along the Belgian border that nobody outside of France has ever heard of. Morharge, Sarrebourg, Charleroi, the Ardennes. And while this was happening in the east, the real German plan was unfolding in the north, the right wing, Schlieffen's hammer, Belgium. The Belgians had decided to fight. Nobody had expected this. Belgium had 12 field divisions and a couple of fortress garrisons. Germany had 7 armies. It was supposed to be a parade. The Belgians had decided to fight. Nobody had expected this. Belgium had 12 field divisions and a couple of fortress garrisons. Germany had 7 armies. It was supposed to be a parade. The Belgians made them fight for every mile. At Liège, the fortifications held out for nearly 2 weeks against German siege artillery, including a new kind of gun, the 42-centimeter howitzer, the Germans called Big Bertha, which could fire a shell the weight of a small car and knock down an entire fortress with one hit. The Belgians fought anyways, at Namur, at Antwerp. They destroyed their own railway lines as they retreated. They burned their own bridges. In response, the Germans burned Belgian towns. They shot civilians they claimed were franc-tireurs, irregular fighters firing at the troops. In Dinant, the Germans killed 600 civilians in a single day. In Louvain, they burned the medieval library with its irreplaceable manuscripts and killed about 250 civilians over 5 nights of reprisals. The rape of Belgium, the newspapers called it. Some of the propaganda was exaggerated. British stories about German soldiers bayoneting babies were invented, but the core was true. Germany was behaving as an occupier, not a guest. And world opinion, which had been neutral in August, was not neutral by September. For the German High Command, none of this mattered. What mattered was the timetable, and the timetable was slipping. The Belgians had bought the Allies a week, maybe 10 days. In a plan that allowed 6 weeks to defeat France, 10 days is a catastrophe. The Belgians, by fighting, had put the Schlieffen Plan behind schedule before he had even crossed the French border. Nobody on the German side understood yet what this meant. They thought they were winning. They thought the red-trousered French dying in their tens of thousands in the east were the main event. They were not. The main event was walking south from Mons, Belgium, under the August sun, the British Expeditionary Force, and behind them the rest of Joffre's French army was about to begin the longest retreat in the country's modern history. The Great Retreat had begun. On August 23, 1914, the British Expeditionary Force made contact with the German army for the first time. The place was Mons, in southern Belgium, a coal mining town, grimy, industrial, crossed by a canal. The British had about 80,000 men in the field, a small army by continental standards, by a professional one, long-service regulars, men who had fought the Boers in South Africa, garrisoned India, learned the trade in small colonial wars across 3 decades, the last great professional army Britain would ever field. They had one weapon the Germans did not expect, the Lee Enfield rifle, a bolt-action repeater with a 10-round magazine and a rate of fire that a trained British regular could push to 15 aimed rounds per minute. The British Army had spent a decade teaching that rifle to its men. The German First Army under Alexander von Kluck came to the close order. They were tired. They did not know the British were there in strength. And when they came over the slag heaps at the canal, the Lee Enfields opened up. The German accounts of Mons are striking. Officers wrote in their diaries that they had walked into machine gun fire, dense, sustained machine gun fire from the British line. They were wrong. The British had only 2 machine guns per battalion. What the Germans were facing was rifle fire. 1 man, 1 bolt, 15 rounds a minute, and enough of those men along the canal that from the German side it sounded like the end of the world. The Germans lost about 5,000 men at Mons. The British lost 1,600. It was tactically a British victory. And it didn't matter. Because on the British right, the French Fifth Army under Lanrezac was collapsing. The whole French line was collapsing. If the British Expeditionary Force stayed at Mons, the Germans would simply walk around them and the 80,000 British regulars would be cut off and destroyed in the first month of the war. Sir John French gave the order to retreat. And here is where the story becomes something harder, something the history books describe in clean arrows or clean maps, which was not clean at all. The Great Retreat, 160 miles, 2 weeks in the August heat. What follows is a composite. It's drawn from letters and diaries of men who walked this road. Every detail comes from someone's testimony. The man is every man. You're a British private from Birmingham, 26 years old. You joined the army 6 years ago because there was no work in Birmingham. Wool uniform, khaki, 60-pound pack on your back, rifle, ammunition, entrenching tool, mess kit, greatcoat, 2 days' rations. You've been walking since 4 this morning. It's now 3 in the afternoon, 90 degrees. White dust coats everything, your eyes, your mouth, the creases of your neck. It mixes with sweat and turns to paste. Your feet have been bleeding inside your boots for 4 days. You haven't eaten a hot meal in 6 days. You haven't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch in a week. You're walking south in a column of men you barely know anymore. Your battalion is broken up, scrambled, and nobody's told you where you're going. Behind you, though you cannot see them, are the Germans. This was the Great Retreat. Men falling asleep on their feet and waking up still walking. Officers dozing in their saddles, waking to realize the horses had stopped because the horses were dead on their feet too. Units scrambled together, nobody quite sure who was in command. Hundreds of men simply sitting down beside the road and refusing to go further, prodded upright by officers who understood that to leave them was to leave them for the Germans. One British officer wrote in his diary, "The men are so tired that they are crying. They are crying as they march. Grown men, professional soldiers, walking south and weeping from exhaustion." And here is the thing that mattered. They did not break. The Great Retreat was not a rout. The French and British armies marching south from the Belgian border did not collapse into a mob. They retreated in units, in formation, with their weapons. In the 2 weeks of the retreat, they walked 160 miles south and fought 14 separate rearguard engagements. Moltke, at his headquarters in Luxembourg, 150 miles behind the front, noticed this. His generals were reporting victory after victory, but the prisoner counts were wrong. The captured artillery counts were wrong. When you rout an army, you take prisoners by the tens of thousands. You capture guns. You find abandoned packs and rifles along every road. The Germans were not finding these things. The French and the British were not routed. They were walking south, and they were going to stop somewhere, and they were going to turn around, and they were going to fight. Moltke wrote to his wife on August 29th, a letter, not an official document, as you can feel the man's anxiety in every line. We have had successes, but we have not yet won. The war is not going to be as short as we thought. The German chief of the general staff, in the 4th week of the war, already telling his wife that the plan may not work. Meanwhile, the Germans were doing something else that would matter by early September. They were marching themselves to death. The Schlieffen Plan depended on speed. Kluck's First Army, Bülow's Second, Hausen's Third. They had to cover enormous distances on foot. They were doing it, 30 kilometers a day, every day, for weeks. But the plan did not account for the fact that you cannot march men 30 kilometers a day for a month and have them still be an effective army at the very end of it. Kluck's First Army had marched over 310 miles on foot in the summer heat, fighting battles along the way. 20,000 men lost to combat, sickness, and struggling. Supply columns 87 miles behind the infantry. 60% of the motorized transport broken down. The horses and the German army was still largely horse-drawn in 1914. They were dying from overwork, from lack of fodder, because the supply trucks carrying the hay were stuck somewhere in Belgium. A German staff officer riding through the ranks of the First Army in late August wrote that the men looked like living scarecrows. Their uniforms were in rags. They had not washed in 3 weeks. The only thing keeping them moving was the promise that Paris was just a few days' march further on. And when Paris fell, the war would be over and they could go home. Paris was not going to fall. On September 2nd, the French government left the capital. The ministers boarded a train at the Gare d'Orléans in the small hours of the morning and were carried south to Bordeaux. Paris prepared for siege. Barricades went up. The bridges over the Seine were rigged with explosive. The Eiffel Tower's radio transmitter was prepared for demolition. And into this city, in the last week of August, a figure arrived who would matter more than anyone in Paris knew. His name was Joseph Simone Gallieni. He was 65 years old. He had retired from the army 3 months earlier, officially for reasons of health. The real reasons was that he was dying of prostate cancer. He had perhaps 2 years to live, and the war had interrupted what was supposed to be a quiet ending. When the government panicked and looked for anyone, to take the post of military governor of Paris, Gallieni was the man they called. He accepted because, as he said, a soldier does not refuse. He moved into Les Invalides, the great complex of the left bank that housed the tomb of Napoleon. He set up his headquarters in an office overlooking the courtyard. And on September 3rd, he issued a proclamation to the people of Paris. Army of Paris, citizens of Paris, the members of the government of the Republic have left Paris to give new impetus to the national defense. I have received a mandate to defend Paris against the invader. This mandate I shall fulfill until the end. To the end. He meant it literally. The old man who was dying of cancer was the only man in France in the first days of September 1914 who was ready to fight to the death of Paris. And as it turned out, he wouldn't have to, because 30 miles east of Paris, a German general was about to make a decision that would change everything. Alexander von Kluck was 68 years old in 1914. He had been a soldier since he was 17. He had fought in the Austro-Prussian War of 1866 and the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. He commanded the German First Army, the tip of the right wing, the hammer that was supposed to swing west of Paris and crush the French against their own fortifications. On the 1st of September 1914, Kluck was somewhere he should not have been. The Schlieffen Plan required his army to pass west of Paris, around the city, to the coast side. That was the whole geometry of the plan. Instead, Kluck was moving southeast of Paris. He was passing the city on the wrong side. And he made this decision completely on his own without asking Moltke. For a reason that, when you hear it, will either make you laugh or make you want to break something, Kluck had decided to chase Lanrezac's Fifth Army. Lanrezac, the French commander who had been retreating in good order since August 24th, was somewhere to Kluck's southeast. And Kluck, who was not an imaginative man who had spent a whole career thinking of war in terms of pursuit and destruction, saw Lanrezac's retreating army as an opportunity. Finish him off, thought Kluck. Run him down, destroy him. That's how you end the wars. But to chase Lanrezac, Kluck had to turn left, southeast instead of south, which meant passing east of Paris instead of west. There was another reason, and this is the reason that if you were writing a novel, it would be too on the nose. Kluck hated taking orders from Bülow. Karl von Bülow commanded the Second Army on Kluck's left. Bülow was technically senior. Kluck was supposed to conform his movements to Bülow's. And Kluck, who was vain, who was proud, who had been a soldier for 51 years, hated it. Hated Bülow personally, as near as one can tell from the diaries and letters. So when Bülow asked Kluck to wheel inward, Kluck did it, but in a way that served his own purposes. He turned southeast. He went after Lanrezac. He crossed the river Marne on September 3rd, heading south. And in doing so, he did something that he did not realize, and that Bülow did not realize, and that Moltke, 150 miles away, did not realize. He opened a gap in the German line, a gap 30 miles wide, 48 kilometers of French countryside, with no German soldiers in it. A hole in the very center of the German advance. And just west of that gap, waiting in Paris, was a fresh French army, the 6th Army under General Michel-Joseph Manoury. 150,000 men, mostly older reservists. Not the cream of the French army, but rested, supplied, and not yet broken. Gallieni had been scraping them together for 2 weeks. He had an army in Paris that was fresh, while the Germans coming toward him were exhausted. And now, thanks to Kluck, he had a gap. He found out about the gap from airplanes. This is one of the most important and most overlooked facts about the First Battle of the Marne. The airplane was 4 years old in 1914. Not 4 years old as a weapon of war. 4 years old, period. The Wright brothers had flown in 1903. By 1914, the airplane was a fragile, slow, unarmed machine of canvas and wire. And nobody really knew what it was for. Except that if you put an observer in it and you flew it over an enemy army, that observer could see things a man on the ground could not see. On the morning of September 3rd, French pilots flew east from airfields from north of Paris, looking for the German First Army. And what they saw and reported back was this. The German First Army was not heading west, it was turning southeast. It was passing east of Paris, and Its right flank, its exposed right flank, was wide open to anyone who attacked it from the west. When Gallieni read those reports, he did something his staff had rarely seen him do. He stood up, walked over the big map on the wall, and after a long silence, he said to his chief of staff, General Clergerie, "They offer us their flank. They offer us their flank." Then he picked up the telephone and called Joffre. The telephone call between Gallieni and Joffre was on the afternoon on September 3rd, 1914. This is one of those moments that historians love because you can feel the entire personality difference between two men in it. Gallieni, sharp, urgent, precise. Attack now, attack the flank. The Germans have made a mistake and we have a window. It's closing. We need to move. Joffre, calm, methodical, the kind of man who did not make a decision until he had finished his lunch. Joffre saying, "I understand, I'll consider it." Gallieni did not accept "I'll consider it." He called back, he sent telegrams, he sent staff officers. For 2 full days, Gallieni bullied and pushed and maneuvered. And on the evening of September 4th, Joffre, slow, calm, methodical, Joffre finally committed. The counterattack would happen on September 6. Joffre issued his order to the entire French army that evening. It is one of the great documents of the war. Read it aloud and you can still hear the voice of a man who understands that everything rides on a single throw of the dice. At the moment of engaging in a battle upon which depends the safety of the country, it is important to remember that the time has passed for looking back. Every effort must be made to attack the enemy and drive him back. Troops that can advance no further must hold the ground. They have won at all costs and must die where they stand rather than give way. Die where they stand rather than give way. This was the order. You have been retreating for 12 days. Tomorrow you turn around. Tomorrow you attack. And if you cannot advance, you die in the field rather than take one step back. And they did. The first battle on the Marne was not one battle, it was 5 battles strung along a front 200 miles wide, from the outskirts of Paris to the marshes of Saint-Gond and beyond, all the way to Verdun. 2 million men fighting in parallel for 6 days. No single narrative can do it justice, so we'll focus on the part that mattered most, the part that turned the battle, and with it, the war. September 5th, 1914. The first contact was an accident. Manoury's 6th Army was moving east under cover of night, into position for the great counterattack Joffre had ordered for the 6th. But Clark had realized sometime on September 4th that he had something on his right flank. He didn't know what. He sent a corps north to investigate. The 4th Reserve Corps under General Hans von Groeneau ran head-on into Manoury's lead divisions near the village of Monthyon, about 30 miles east of Paris, around 2 in the afternoon of September 5th. Neither side expected contact. They slammed into each other and opened fire. What was meant to be a simple reconnaissance turned into an opening clash on the Canal Ourcq. And Clark, hearing the gunfire, realized immediately that he had a problem on his right. He began to turn his army, units, divisions, a corps here, a corps there, pulled out of the line chasing Langezac and marched north to deal with this new French army that had suddenly appeared where no French army was supposed to be. Every unit Clark turned north opened the gap wider. September 6, 1914, the counterattack begins. The whole front erupts. From Paris to Verdun, the French armies turn around and attack. It is the largest counterattack in the history of warfare up to that point. And Joffre's order had gone out to every man. Die where you stand rather than give way. They believed it. This is the hard thing, the thing that modern sensibilities have trouble with. The French soldiers of 1914, the ones who had survived the red-trousered massacres of August, who had walked 160 miles south, whose feet were bleeding and whose stomachs were empty, those soldiers turned around on September 6 and attacked. Not because they were brave, though they were brave, because they understood there was nowhere else to go. Paris was behind them. If Paris fell, France fell. So they attack. In the east, Foch's newly formed Ninth Army in the marshes of Saint-Gond fought a battle against German assault troops that at one point crossed those same marshes 4 separate times. Foch, in a dispatch that became famous, reported to Joffre, "My center is giving way, my right is pushed back. Situation excellent, I am attacking." Situation excellent, I am attacking. This is not the cult of the offensive anymore. This is not elan, spirit. This is a commander who understands he has no choice. That retreat means defeat, that the only option left is to push forward and hope the Germans break first. And the Germans on September 6 and 7 were starting to break. Not in a rout, not in a collapse, but in their cohesion. Clark, pulling divisions north to face Manoury, had now pulled so many that the gap between his army and Boulos was no longer 30 miles wide. It was 40 miles wide, 50. And into that gap, slowly but steadily, the British Expeditionary Force was advancing. Sir John French, who a week earlier had been ready to evacuate his entire army to the Channel ports, did not want to advance. Joffre had traveled personally to his headquarters at Melun on September 5th to convince him. There is a story that Joffre, the calm, methodical, nothing rattles me Joffre, pounded his fist on the table and said, "The honor of England is at stake." French was moved. The British regulars began to march north into the gap. September 7th, the taxis of the Marne. This is the story everybody remembers, and like most stories everybody remembers, it is half true and half legend. Manoury's Sixth Army was in trouble. Clark's reinforcements were arriving faster than expected. Manoury needed more men urgently, and the French 7th Infantry Division was sitting at a railway station outside Paris with no trains available to move it. Gallieni and Clergerie had an idea. Paris in 1914 had about 10,000 licensed taxicabs. Most of them Renault Type AG. Most of the drivers had already been drafted. Of the 10,000 taxis, only about 3,000 were still operating. Driven by older men, 55 to 65, too old for the front. On the night of September 6, on Gallieni's order, the Paris police went through the city stopping taxis, removing the passengers and ordering the drivers to report to the Esplanade des Invalides. Imagine the scene, a summer night in Paris, the city half empty, the government gone, the streets eerie with the absence of traffic. Along the boulevards, the gendarmerie with whistles flagging down cabs. "Sorry ma'am, all you get for the war, for France." By 10 o'clock, 630 taxi cabs were parked in ranks on the Esplanade des Invalides, the same place where for 100 years Napoleon's body had been resting in its crypt. 630 cabs, headlights on, drivers standing beside them, waiting. Orders came. The cabs drove out to the railway station of Paris, where the 103rd and 104th Infantry Regiments were waiting. 5 soldiers per cab, packs and rifles squeezed in with them. Then, in a long convoy, engines running through the night at 25 kilometers an hour. The taxis carried French reservists to Nanteuil-les-Anduin, 31 miles northeast of Paris. Over the next day, more convoys brought the total between 3,000 and 6,000 men. The exact number doesn't really matter. Militarily, it was marginal. The drivers were paid at the meter rate. And here's the truth the legends usually leave out. The taxis did not save the Marne. Manoury's Sixth Army had 150,000 men. Most had arrived by train. A few thousand more men delivered by taxi was not a militarily decisive contribution. If the taxis had not driven at all, the battle would very probably have gone the same way. But the taxis did something else. They gave France a story. In a country whose government had fled, whose army had been massacred in its red trousers, whose capital was preparing for a siege, the taxis of the Marne were a story of civilian Paris rising up to help the army. Old men driving their cabs to the front at midnight, the Union Sacrée, the sacred union of civilian and military France. It was a myth, but it was a myth France needed. And for the rest of the war and for decades afterwards, the taxis of the Marne would be the image that stood for the battle. Not the machine guns, not the artillery, not the 250,000 French dead, the taxis. Old men in landaulettes driving through the night, saving Paris. September 9th, the hinge. By September 9th, the German position was becoming unsustainable. The gap between the First and Second Armies had grown beyond what anyone could cover. The British Expeditionary Force was moving into it. The French Fifth Army, led by Franchet d'Espèrey, another one of Joffre's new promotions, and the French army called Desperate Frankie, was attacking Bülow's right flank and pushing him back. Bülow, on the evening of September 8, sent a message to Moltke that would decide the battle. He said his army was in danger of being outflanked. He was considering a retreat. The situation was, he used the word critical. Moltke, 150 miles away in Luxembourg, could not see any of this directly. He was dependent on telegraph messages that took hours to arrive, and telephone lines kept cutting out. He was trying to command a battle he could not see, with tools that did not work over distances that were too great. So he did something that in retrospect was extraordinary. He sent a staff officer in a car to the front, with full authority to assess the situation and order a retreat if he thought one was necessary. The officer's name was Lieutenant Colonel Richard Hensch. He was a 45-year-old staff colonel, not an army commander, not a field marshal, a colonel from the intelligence branch. On September 8 and 9, Hensch drove from an army headquarters to another one along the Marne front. At each stop, he heard a version of the same story. We're tired, we're stretched, we are in trouble, we cannot hold forever. When Hensch reached Kluck's headquarters on the morning of September 9, he made the decision Moltke had authorized him to make. He ordered a general retreat. A colonel acting on delegated authority ordered the German army to abandon the Schlieffen Plan. Kluck protested. He believed he was winning on his own front. And he probably was, against Manoury, tactically. But Hensch showed him the larger picture. The British were in the gap. Bülow was already retreating. If the First Army stayed where it was, it would be surrounded and destroyed. Kluck turned his army north. The retreat began. By September 10th, all 5 German armies of the Marne front were withdrawing. They fell back 40 miles to a new line along the river Aisne, where they dug in. The Schlieffen Plan, the plan that had taken 20 years to design and 6 weeks to execute, was dead. When the news reached Moltke, he collapsed. Some accounts say he suffered a nervous breakdown. Others describe him weeping in front of his staff. Either way, he was finished. On September 14th, the Kaiser relieved him of command. Moltke lived on for 2 more years, broken, and died in 1916. And in Paris, Gallieni, the dying old man who had seen the gap first, received a telegram from Joffre. It said, in effect, "We have won. The miracle of the Marne." That's what they will call it in France within a week. Le miracle de la Marne. Because a week earlier, Paris had been 30 miles from capture, and now the Germans were retreating. It felt like a miracle, But it wasn't. It was Joffre's order, it was Gallieni's telephone calls. It was French pilots reporting from the air, and Kluck's pride, and Moltke's distance, and 250,000 French dead in fields along the Marne whose names nobody would remember. But the French called it a miracle, and the name stuck. And for the next 3.5 years, that line would barely move. Advance a mile, fall back a mile, take a hill, lose a hill. Millions of men would die trying to break through it. At Verdun, at the Somme, at Passchendaele, at the Chemin des Dames. And the line would still be there in November 1918, when the war finally ended. Almost exactly what he had been in October 1914. This is what the Marne created, not a French victory, not a German defeat, a stalemate that would take 4 more years, 10 million dead soldiers, and the complete destruction of the old European order to resolve. The historian Barbara Tuchman, in her book The Guns of August, said it better than I can. The Marne was decisive not because he determined who would win the war. It was decisive because he determined that the war would go on, that there will be no quick ending, that the nations of Europe, having blundered into this catastrophe, were now trapped in it. There was no looking back, she wrote. The nations were caught in a trap made during the first 30 days out of battles that failed to the decisive, a trap from which there was and has been no exit. No exit. That is what the Marne meant. The moment when the door closed behind Europe. The moment when the short war that everybody wanted became the long war that nobody knew how to stop. Step back from the map for a moment. Look at the battle we just walked through. 3 men made 3 decisions across 6 days. Kluck turning his army southeast instead of west. Gallieni seeing the gap and refusing to let it go. Moltke breaking under the weight of a battle he could not see. 3 decisions, 3 specific men. Change any one of them and the 20th century is a different century. Let me show you what I mean. First, what if Kluck had obeyed orders? If Kluck had done what the Schlieffen Plan required, swing west of Paris. There is no gap in the German line. No exposed flank. Manouil's 6th Army has nothing to attack. The British Expeditionary Force had nowhere to advance. The Germans complete their encirclement. Paris is surrounded. The French government, already in Bordeaux, is cut off. The French army, pinned against its own border fortresses, has 2 choices: surrender or be annihilated. France is out of the war by the end of September. And Kluck nearly did obey orders. The only reasons he didn't were that he wanted to catch Langezac and he didn't like Bülow. That's it. A personal rivalry between 2 60-something German generals. If Kluck had been more disciplined, or if Bülow had been more tactful, the Schlieffen Plan works. France falls, the war is over in 6 weeks. Second, what if Gallieni hadn't been in Paris? Gallieni was 65, retired, dying of cancer. The only reason he was military governor of Paris is because the government panicked, and he was the only general willing to say yes. If Gallieni had been in a hospital bed in Versailles instead of an office at Les Invalides, nobody sees the gap. The reconnaissance report came in and sat on someone's desk. Joffre, who was slow to act even with Gallieni hammering him for 2 days, is not going to launch a counterattack on his own. The window closes. The gap fills back up. Same outcome as the first scenario, just a few days later. Third, what if Moltke had held his nerve? The German armies at the Marne on September 9th were not beaten. They were tired. They were stretched. They were confused, but not beaten. If Moltke had been at the front, if he had been able to see the situation, if he had held firm, the retreat does not happen. The Germans close the gap themselves. Paris is still 30 miles away. But Moltke was 150 miles from the front. His communication was failing, and the man he sent, a colonel, made a decision that was not his to make. Moltke accepted it. He let a colonel make the most important decision in German military history. And then he broke. Any of those three moments goes the other way, and France loses the war in the autumn of 1914. And if France loses in 1914, Russia fights on for maybe another year. But without a French army in the west, Germany shifts everything east. Russia collapses by the end of 1914. No long Eastern Front means no revolution, no Lenin, no Bolsheviks, no Soviet Union. And if there is no long Western Front, there is no Verdun, no Somme, no Passchendaele, no 10 million dead, no lost generation, no Treaty of Versailles, because Germany has won. No humiliated Germany, no Weimar Republic, no Adolf Hitler rising from the ashes of 1918, because 1918 is a German victory, no World War II, at least not the one we got. The world you live in, every border, every government, every grandfather who didn't come home runs through those 6 days in September 1914. Through three decisions that could have all gone the other way, through Kluck's pride and Gallieni's telephone calls and Moltke's broken nerve. That's what the Marne is, not just a battle, a hinge on which the entire 20th century turned. But here is the thing. Even if the Marne had gone the other way, even if Paris had fallen, even if France had surrendered in September 1914, the world was already changed. Not because of who won the battle, because of what the battle was, because of the weapons that fought it. A few episodes back, we were in Pennsylvania, July 1863, Gettysburg, Pickett's charge, 12,000 men walking shoulder to shoulder across a mile of open field into enemy fire. Rifled muskets firing 3 rounds a minute, smoothbore cannons, bayonets, men you could see, killing other men you could see. 51 years separates Gettysburg from the Marne. 51 years, less than the lifetime of the officers who planned this war. The doctrine was the same. The manuals were the same. The uniforms were almost the same. The red trousers of those French soldiers in 1914, those were the same trousers the French had worn in 1870. The weapons were not. The rifles, first at Gettysburg, a rifle musket fired 3 rounds per minute, loaded from the muzzle. By 1914, the standard infantry weapon was the bolt-action repeater, the Mauser, the Liebel, the Lee Enfield magazine-fed, effective at 500 meters, 8 trained soldiers firing 15 aimed shots per minute. One soldiers doing the work of 5 from 1863. When British regulars dug in at Mons, the Germans walking toward them thought they were facing machine guns. They weren't. The rules of the attack had changed. Nobody at the top had noticed. The machine gun. At Gettysburg, it didn't exist. Well, even if it was invented a few years earlier, it was not used. By 1914, the Maxim and its children, water-cooled, belt-fed, 400 to 600 rounds per minute, operated by a crew of 2 or 3. The firepower of 100 riflemen concentrated into a single position that could sweep a field. This is what killed the red trousers. Every French infantry charge into the cult of the offensive died in front of machine guns. 27,000 Frenchmen dead on August 22nd alone, more than any single day of the entire war. The French army figured out in blood. By September, they had stopped charging. That's what the retreat to the Marne actually bought them. The time to unlearn 40 years of bad doctrine. Artillery at Gettysburg, the 12-pounder Napoleon smoothbore, direct fire, a mile of range. Gunners aiming at what they could see. By 1914, the French 75, the German 77, rifled, breech-loading, hydraulic recoil, accurate to 5 miles, high-explosive shells that detonated above the enemy and rained steel downward. And this is the weapon that killed the most soldiers in World War I, not the rifle, not the machine gun, the artillery. By some estimates, 70% of all deaths in the war came from shells fired by men who never saw their targets. At Gettysburg, it was around 10%. The infantryman of 1914 was mostly a man waiting to be killed by someone he'd never meet. Then there were the tools that were new at the Marne itself, airplanes, brand new, unarmed, fragile, made of canvas and wood. But Gallieni sees clocks turn because a French pilot flew over the German columns and reported what he saw. First time in a major battle that aerial reconnaissance changes the outcome. Motor transport, primitive and unreliable. But the Paris taxes exist because of it. Radio, barely, which is why Moltke couldn't command his own armies. But the tools that weren't there yet, tanks, 1916, poison gas, 1915, flamethrowers, 1915, air combat, 1915 and 16, all of it comes after the Marne. All of it gets invented because of what the Marne revealed. That this was going to be a long war, an industrial war, and the side that invented new ways to kill was going to win. The Marne was the last battle of the old warfare and the first battle of the new. Cavalry still changed, men still marched the information, but they charged and marched into a kind of firepower that had never existed before, and nobody, not the generals who planned this, not the soldiers who fought it, not the politicians who approved it, nobody really understood what they had built until they saw it kill. A French soldier diary from Verdun in 1916 captures something the statistics can't. He wrote, "Humanity is mad. It must be mad to do what it's doing. What a massacre. What scenes of horror and carnage. I cannot find words to translate my impressions. Hell cannot be so terrible. Men are mad." Men are mad. That is what the Marne produced. Not a victory, not a defeat. An industrial charnel house that ran without stopping for 4 years. Because nobody knew how to make it stop. The Marne killed the war. Europe thought it was fighting and replaced it with a different war. A longer, uglier, more industrial war than nobody in 1914 could have imagined. And nobody in 1914 knew how to fight. The soldiers who turned around on September 6 and attacked and died where they stood, rather than give way, those soldiers saved their country. They also, without knowing it, trapped their country. Because the war they saved France from was the 6-week war of Schlieffen and Moltke. The war they trapped France, it was the 4-year war of Verdun and the Somme. 1.5 million Frenchmen would die before it was over. 2 million Germans, 1 million British and Imperial troops, 2 million from Austria and Hungary, 2 million Russians, Ottoman Turks, Italians, Americans, Romanians, Bulgarians, Serbs, millions more. 10 million soldiers dead by November 1918, a generation erased. 4 empires destroyed, the map of the world redrawn. All of it running back to those 6 days in September 1914 to a 68-year-old German general who wouldn't take orders from his colleague, to a 65-year-old French general dying of cancer in an office at Les Invalides, to a chief of staff who lost his nerve in Luxembourg and a colonel who drove along the Marne in a car making decisions above his rank, to French pilots in canvas airplanes looking down, and to 250,000 French dead in the fields that nobody remembers. The miracle of the Marne. It wasn't a miracle, it was the point where everything could have gone a different way and didn't. And the world we live in is the world that came out the other side. Next time we will go to Stalingrad in 1942 and we will see another decisive battle fought in another part of the world. I will see you on the next battlefield. Thank you very much for following up. Bye.